Welcome to GPS today. I don't know if you were with us last week, but our Dr. Jon Paulien was waxing eloquent with Halo and games and tying that to the great controversy in the book of Revelation. But in our off-camera time, we have talked about, we would try to give one show to the whole history and the theme of the sanctuary, particularly here in Revelation 4 and 5. It's all through the book, of course, and maybe he'll go there too. But maybe we should introduce it 1 minute, John. What's the background? There's a sanctuary in the Old Testament, Exodus 25, holy place, most holy place, altar, laver. Then we have what? Solomon's temple is the next big step, which would be the huge temple destroyed 586. Am I guessing right here? We just taught Judaism and world religions. I'm trying to get all this back straight. And then what? We call the second temple.
And there was the Zerubbabel's temple, which was after the return from Babylon.
That's called second temple.
Yeah.
Technically. Where does Herod's temple fit into all of this?
Well, Herod's temple was a remodel and expansion of Zerubbabel's temple.
Of the second temple.
Yeah.
Okay, so sanctuary, Solomon, second, Herod's expansion, and then destroyed Titus. Is that the Romans?
80, 70. Yeah,
80,
Titus.
70. And from then till now,
no temple.
no temple. There are those who believe Jesus can't come until there is another temple rebuilt, but now it's a Muslim mosque. So is this really important to bring back something that's been kind of gone for 2,000 years and find nuances here? Does a person need to understand the sanctuary in order to understand Revelation? I guess is really where I'm going.
The way you phrased that question, yes, definitely. Because if you totally ignore the sanctuary imagery, a big aspect of Revelation is going to be missing. For example, sanctuaries embedded in the introductory visions of each part of the book. For example, the 7 churches open with an introductory vision of Jesus, this bright and shining figure, and where is he standing? Among the candlesticks.
Yes.
Okay, there's sanctuary image. He's wearing a foot-length robe with a golden sash over his chest, according to a doctoral dissertation that I supervised not long ago, high priestly imagery. Chapter 4 and 5, I've identified at least 14 sanctuary images in there, from incense to the trumpet and to the worship, the singing, etc. You've about 14 different sanctuary images in that chapter. And the entire sanctuary is touched on in chapters 4 and 5. When you get to chapter 8, the introduction to the trumpets is a view of the altar of incense. Get to chapter 11, the introduction to what happens there is the Ark of the Covenant and the most holy place. In chapter 15, you have the temple in heaven,
Yes.
etc. So as you work your way through, if you totally ignore the sanctuary, you misunderstand Revelation.
Someone told me the city of heaven is a cube, and that like the most holy place was a cube.
Well, the most holy place and the New Jerusalem are the only cubes in the Bible. So the New Jerusalem is designed as, in a sense, a most holy place.
God's throne in the center.
Yeah.
What about Revelation 11 where it says, I looked and saw no temple there? What do you do with that?
Well, the way I've understood that is you start on earth. And so the view of the lampstands in chapter 1 are on earth. I mean, John doesn't look up to see Jesus, he looks behind him. Jesus is on the island behind him. And these candlesticks are churches, so that's earthly. But then in chapter 4, John ascends up into heaven, and the next 5 sanctuary scenes are all in heaven. But then, at the end of the book, the New Jerusalem comes back down to earth. And there it says there's no temple there because God is present with his people.
So that's talking about down here again.
So you don't have a temple building as such in the Garden of Eden, but God is interacting with Adam and Eve directly.
Face, yeah.
You see, at the end, you don't need a temple because God is present among his people. They're not frightened or harmed by his glorious presence, you see. So,
Well, isn't it, I mean, I think I read this somewhere, but like that he was the temple. And so
Right.
he's embodying it. And so even if you were to do a word transplant in that area, like technically the temple would be present because heaven is wherever he is.
right.
You know, and so I think it's interesting because I think we get stuck on the physical structures. I think there's importance to obviously the sanctuary things and like helping us understand where the context was coming from and how he was explaining it. And I think we would miss it all, but I think we get caught up in that sometimes so much that we miss the importance of Jesus's presence in that space.
Right.
You know.
Two quick things. First, Exodus 25:8 says, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." But then the question is, when he tells them to make a sanctuary, why is it made the way it is? And I remember I was in En-Gedi once, which is near the Dead Sea. We hiked up into the sort of a hill there. It was really steep, you know, like a mountain. And at the top, there were the ruins of a temple. And it had 2 apartments, and outside there was a fire pit and so on. And I said, whoa, that's interesting. When was this built? And the archaeologist was, well, that's about 3000 BC. And I says, wait a minute, Moses' temple was 1500 BC. You mean this thing was here more than 1,000 years before Moses lived? And that suddenly created a shift in my mind. I said, oh, God was meeting people where they are. He was giving them something that they needed to understand.
And I think that's what's so hard for me to explain to some people because I know a lot of people have so much Bible knowledge and I sit in awe of how much they can like quote to me and explain to me. But then when I research it for myself, I find out there's this whole different context, and within the culture that it was coming from, that's not actually the surprising part. You know, what they're fixated on and what they're stressed out about or whatever they think is their message to the world, in the context it was given to the people it was given to, that wouldn't have even been part of the conversation. That was that's everywhere. But wow, you're saying that part, you know, like love or, you know, whatever it may be. And it's the thing that maybe we gloss over. And so I think it's important to be aware of that there are we replicated things that were already existing, even in a pagan society or whatever you want, it's a Gentile society, and we used it and moved it into something good.
Now you can play that 2 different ways. You can say that these earlier pagan temples are a dim recollection of God's original sanctuary. And so that's why they look like the one that came. Or you can say that God shaped the Hebrew sanctuary to meet the understanding and worldview of the people that had developed over time. I think both of those are probably true.
How do you feel about the need to have something physical or real or visual to help you with religion, to mediate God to you?
Well, do you know of any religion that doesn't have buildings?
Well, the reason I'm asking immediately is because of being in Vietnam for a couple of weeks. Virtually every store we went into or hotel had a little shrine. This is Mahayana Buddhism, you know, Northern Buddhism. And so they had a little, just you know, with a goatee and that god, and then they had, you know, the one of wealth and the fat laughing Buddha. And incense and flowers and food. And it's very real. You know, you walk in, there's your God blessing your business sitting right there. You don't have to do some mental gymnastics, hope that there's a God of faith out here. He's right there. And I'm just curious about that. You're looking for an answer here.
Yeah, I was just looking at, I thought of Isaiah 57:15, but it's not exactly the text I'm looking for. It says, "Thus says the high and exalted one, who lives forever, whose name is holy. I dwell in a high and holy place, and also with the contrite and lowly of spirit." So, in a sense, a temple can never contain God. Because God, on the one hand, is very other, and yet on the other hand is willing to set up residence inside of us.
Paul says he's not far.
So, temple ultimately is wherever God is.
But is there a human need that makes God real? And do we struggle with the Protestant? We don't want pictures, we don't want images, we don't want anything that localizes God. But now we struggle to have anything in our head to say, there he is.
So I think this is where one of my biggest frustrations was when I first moved to the US, because I'm a visual learner, I'm a visual everything, and that's why I studied art. Overseas, there was an experience that went along with your worship, right? Because you're surrounded by things that create an experience for you. And like even weird stuff, like in our streets in Africa, we had like little sacrifices in the middle. Do you remember this? In the middle of the roads, and like they were their sacrifices. And if you hit them, all the evil from that family would get transferred to you. Like it's weird stuff, but like everything was part of an experience. There was symbolism everywhere. And so just in your everyday life, you were living a symbolic life, and you were just like more aware of it. You were just reminded of it. And so when I moved to the US, and church was just church, like you show up one day a week and you go to a service and then you walk out, I was like, this isn't.
But the rest of it is all very austere, and you have to do it by faith.
Right. And though I am a huge advocate for experiencing Jesus and separating yourself from physical structures and not needing, like tearing down those things, I'm a huge into that as well. I think there's something beautiful about creating a space for people to be able to have that sense of awe. Like, I enjoy Mass, which I know might get me in huge trouble, but I enjoy Mass because I'm in a space that's so big, and there's art, and there's this, like, there's little pads that you can kneel on, and you can kneel and actually be in the presence of like this.
There's pageantry and candles and smells and incense.
And it kind of takes me out of my bubble of the universe and puts me in another one where I can experience something different. And so I think for me, it's helpful at times. I like going to Hindu temples and seeing what's going on and seeing the art and experiencing it, because that gives me a perspective that maybe I wouldn't have seen otherwise, because that helps stimulate the different senses. But I think we get caught up in trying to box in God, and that's where the trouble comes.
And that's where the negative, and I guess I'm searching for, should we have little shrines in our houses for Jesus? You know, should we have? Bill Hybels has a crown of thorns, and I forget what else they on his altar, and he has a little place. He prays, you know. There's visual symbols of that. And we have said no, you know, in our churches. I've had Orthodox people come to my church. Where's the art? You know, how can I worship here? There's no pictures. I need something.
And then the Muslim comes and says, you got pictures? That's idolatry.
Yeah, and I took all of our students to the mosque, and they said, well, you all talked about that. The carpet was beautiful where you kneel, but there's nothing else. You're focused on God alone. You bow down to God. So there's the two sides.
And it's a struggle, because I think that's where it's so hard for me to explain, because I'm an even split. Like, I don't like the boxing in of God act of like, this is the only place you can worship.
Localizing, minimizing him.
Right, but I also enjoy the cultural experience that you go through when you have art and expressions of understanding him. If only we could find a way to do that where people weren't boxing.
But here's the beauty of the sanctuary concept, both in the Old Testament and in the book of Revelation. The beauty of it is God is saying, you need it, so I'm going to give it to you. You know, and
was he happy to do it, or was he condescending to them?
You got this temple, etc. Well, read the Exodus stuff. You know,
was he doing that because they were used to that? Like, okay, I'll give you a king because you seem to want a king like everyone else. Okay, I'll give you a king. Or was he really part of his plan to have this whole pageantry and lambs and sacrifices?
Well, if the sanctuary had been absolutely necessary, it wouldn't have happened at the time of Moses. It would have been much sooner, wouldn't it? You see? And actually, for those who appreciate the writings of Ellen White, in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 364, and I'd have brought it, but I didn't know we were going there. But she has this fascinating comment that says, if humanity had learned the lessons of the first sacrifice, you know, after the Garden of Eden, there would have been no need for circumcision. And if people had truly grasped what God was trying to communicate through the circumcision, there'd have been no need for the 10 Commandments. And if people had truly obeyed the 10 Commandments, there would have been no need for the additional regulations. And that the sanctuary is part of those additional regulations. So it's kind of a plan D in that paragraph.
Interesting.
That it is a way to illustrate God and illustrate what God is doing in the world. But it isn't life and death in the sense, boy, if you don't get it, you'll never know anything about God. God has a variety of ways of communicating with us.
He would just keep trying until he finally reaches where he needs to get to.
Yeah. In Jeremiah, doesn't it say, he says, I never gave you all these sacrifices and stuff. He says, when you were coming out of Egypt. So there it's recognizing that There was a time when that wasn't as important to God, but later on it was. But he's doing that because in Jeremiah it's become too important. He says, well, why are you overplaying this thing?
Interesting. And then with the bronze snake, he got upset with them that they were worshiping that.
Yeah.
And so, okay, we're going to blow it up now. Get it out of here.
And I think that's where it gets dodgy is I don't think God does anything necessarily up there because he needs it from us. I think everything is like, okay, well, I'll help you out again. Like, you were on the right track. Let me just help hone that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that it's easy for us to start worshiping things just because we are tangible human beings. Like the mystery and the unknown and the free thought is very scary to a lot of people. And not knowing a definitive answer is incredibly terrifying to a lot of people.
Some people can't do God without music.
Absolutely. And so I think that's why God's cool, though, is that God opens it up for dialogue. He's not going to be like, oh, because you can't sit for 12 hours straight reading the Bible cover to cover once a month, I'm going to make a plan B and create music and art and nature and things that you can go experience in a totally different manner. And then you'll get the same kind of fill up, And so, I think that there's this balance that has to be struck.
And it's very difficult for me because I teach world religion, but I take people to these places all over the world. I go to Buddhist temples, and we take the coins and put them in buckets, and it's very real, it's very tangible. You ring the bells at the temple in Chiang Mai. And God says, okay, I'm going to build a sanctuary, and you'll have smoke, and there will be a glory, a Shekinah glory, right here in front of you, trying to mediate his reality to people the best way he can. Well, let's get to Revelation 4 and 5.
Okay.
Now, you have a list of, you memorized them, or you have them in front of you, the 15 Revelation 5 metaphors for sanctuary?
Well, one of the features of the sanctuary, and it helps to know a little bit about it to understand what I'm going to say, but there was a daily service in the temple that happened twice a day. And at the time when Revelation was written, Jerusalem had just been destroyed, but in the temple before its destruction, when the daily service happened, the first thing a priest would do would be to throw open the door of the sanctuary and trim the lamps. In other words, overnight maybe the lamps had gone out, they run out of oil, or maybe the flame went out, and so you refill the oil, you get it burning again so that everything's back the way it should be. And then go to the altar of sacrifice and sacrifice a lamb. And then the blood of that lamb was poured out at the base of that altar. And then in the fire, they would take a censer and take coals from that and take them inside the sanctuary and minister the incense at the altar of incense. While that's going on, people out in the courtyard are to be absolutely silent. And then, when the priest comes out, he takes that censer and slams it to the ground.
Every day?
Every day. And the ring, it says in one of the Jewish writings, the ring of that censer being thrown down could be heard throughout Jerusalem, even into the suburbs.
Wow.
So it was such a loud noise on the floor of the sanctuary. Now, when you read the first half of Revelation, you discover all of that is there. The trimming of the lamps, Jesus is there ministering to the lamps, the open door, the slain lamb, the souls under the altar. The only thing that ever happens under the altar in the sanctuary is the pouring out of the blood.
Interesting.
At the base of the altar. And then you have 7 trumpet priests who blow the trumpets, and there's a half hour of silence, and the censer is thrown down, and so on. It's all there in the book of Revelation. So the first half of the book of Revelation builds on this daily service, this Tamid service. Second half builds on the Day of Atonement.
Interesting.
Which is the yearly service.
This is known by all scholars, or is this something you come up with all by yourself?
I think the first person to bring this out is a fellow named Michael Golder, about 50 years ago, is the first one to notice this. But first of all, a person would have to study the writings, the Jewish writings that tell us what was going on in the temple before its destruction. And anybody can read that. The book is entitled the Mishnah. And if in Mishnah you go to the chapter called Tamid, T-A-M-I-D, you'll read everything I was just saying.
That's the daily.
And then you go to Revelation and say, whoa, this is all happening about the same order. That's got to be intentional. And then Day of Atonement, that's the chapter on Yom Kippur. And there you see what the Day of Atonement services were like, and a lot of that is referenced in the second half of the book. Seventh-day Adventists, in interpreting the book of Revelation, have always felt that the first half of the book is kind of historical. It talks about what's going on in the world generally, but the second half of the book is about the end of time. And the way that it references the sanctuary supports that kind of division. And so when we're in chapter 5, we are in this historical part of the book. And so locating that somewhere, and we've located it as the day of Pentecost, AD 31, when Jesus ascended to heaven, was enthroned at the right hand of God. That was a specific event in history. And the outcome of that event was Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit was poured out on the earth, because Jesus now is in charge.
Just for a moment of clarification, when you understand inspiration, do you feel like God reveals it with that sanctuary construct? Or does he reveal pictures and scenes and all that? And John, who knows these things, marries the two and brings that, and that becomes his writing vehicle? Or does God just inspire that from the very beginning? What do you think?
Yeah, I guess the answer to that is yes. I think of an Anglican scholar named Stephen Moyes, who was a visiting professor at my institution 15 years ago or so. And he gave a lecture from his study of the book of Revelation. He said the book of Revelation has two sources. John had a vision. Something happened that was supernatural. But John also was a researcher. And there's plenty of evidence in the book that he carefully studied the Old Testament and tried to make connections and described things in certain ways because of his knowledge of the Old Testament. So Revelation is kind of a blend between the vision, which provides the basic inspiration, then John writing out the vision in a form that he's familiar with. And you say, how did this happen? God meets people where they are. He knew who John was, and he knew how he would treat the vision. And so the research choices John makes are also inspired.
And would you say that the people who listened to it when they sat in Laodicea, or when they got the letter sent to them, they know the sanctuary, they've been around it or seen it, would they catch it quicker than we had to wait 1,800 years for this man to come up with it? Would they have seen it quicker than we do?
Well, my argument has always been among my scholarly friends that when we do this type of exegesis, we are recapturing what would have been natural to them.
That's my question, yeah.
God meeting people where they are means the message made sense when it was first given. They might not have understood everything that God intended, but it was there at a particular time for a purpose. God gave Revelation in 95 AD, not 1995.
Right.
And therefore, if we're reading it as if it was a recent work, we're going to misread it.
What should people go home with now? Or they're at home and they're listening to this, and they say, okay, now I accept it. There's a sanctuary motif all the way through the book of Revelation, and especially in these chapters. What does that do for you? Where do you go home with on that in your spiritual life?
Well, for Seventh-day Adventists, that's an important insight because Adventists have often been accused of being an Old Testament faith. You know, you don't have enough Jesus, and you don't have enough New Testament, and so on. And to show that the sanctuary, it's certainly important to the author of Hebrews, and to show that it's also important in the book of Revelation, helps to support the idea you can be a Christian and yet still be interested in these things. And the sanctuary can teach you things about Jesus you might not otherwise have known. So that I think, from an Adventist perspective, is very important.
I think, I know I've had some conversations with some of my friends that have decided not to be part of the Adventist Church anymore. And one of their biggest complaints is we use these words and we don't often know how they apply to us or what they actually mean for our daily lives. And it's true. I realize that sometimes I go into the jargon and I say things and then I'm like, I don't know how to back that up. Or I don't know, yeah, there's a theological or a super conservative viewpoint of it where I can explain it in these bullet points. But to be able to take that information and apply it to my daily life it doesn't really do anything, you know? And so it's all future talk or all past talk, and it has no relevance to now. So how would, I guess my question is, how does this fit into our daily life?
Yeah, well, I think we sometimes forget that God meets people where they are, and that means we need to meet people where they are. And if we are giving an outline that just makes no sense to anybody, it's not going to be effective, even though it once was effective. So I think the first thing that has to happen is people need to be motivated to even want to do that study. So in your generation, for example, what would motivate a person to actually spend time reading this book? That can be challenging because games might seem to be more fun.
Yep.
And
Netflix.
Reality is boring. You know?
Netflix is
all the rest of that.
time consuming.
So are there ways that these biblical truths can be brought through games, through video, et cetera? And many people are attempting to do some of those kinds of things. But I think for the person who really cares about the meaning of Scripture, then these kind of things that we're doing in this program become very, very important, because if you're going to invest a lot of time in Scripture, the worst thing that can happen is you get it wrong.
Right.
Because then what's the point? You invest all this time in Scripture study and you're running off on nonsense. That would be the worst of all possible outcomes.
If God were doing it now, would he do a sanctuary system, or would he use media?
I don't think so.
He would use media, he would use... I had a kid present a paper last week on the Avatar. Not the movie Avatar, but some cartoon, something, I didn't know. Many parallels. It was a terrific little paper, 3-page paper. Would God use the medium? And that was the medium that he needed to use then, with sanctuary and incense and drama and God's presence here and all the rest. And I will take responsibility to take the sin from you to this lamb out of the wilderness. If he was doing it today, he would use what would communicate to people today.
I think there's evidence of that in the Bible itself. We talked about Hecate, the Greek goddess. That was the first and the last, the beginning and the end.
Revelation.
The keys of heaven and hell and so on. So many parallels with Jesus, and it's right there in chapter 1. You have the Word in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh. The Word, as a person, is nowhere in the Old Testament. But in Greek philosophy, it's a concept of a second God who mediates between God and the creation. And so you can see taking contemporary ideas and using that to shape the message so that it makes sense. And that's crucial, what we have to do, and we need to do it with your generation as well as ours.
Very good,
We need
very
to teach
good.
people how to read.
Yeah, well.
As usual, we're looking at a clock that counts down on us and says, here it is. Good stuff, John. Thank you for the sanctuary, which I had not thought much about. And the split between the first half and the second half, great stuff. We are going to go to Revelation 6. And transition in our next week's show, please be with us. Revelation 6 and the seals and the 4 horsemen and all of that. Be with us on GPS. We'll love to have you. God bless you.